So I think we have about 15 or 20 minutes for questions, and I can keep a queue if there's a lot. Please.
Thank you all for the sake of brevity. I just have one question for Enzo and one for you, if I may. In Bataille's more or less, Georges Bataille's more or less hallucinatory vision of Inca, but also Aztec, he links cannibalism and all forms of incorporation to the Eucharist. And I wonder if this is a topic that comes up. And I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on the arms trade. And also, I didn't understand the link to Levy. What was how those two came together? I realize you left things out. Thank you.
So I started with actually have an answer for you for something that I couldn't read. So I think in terms of religion, I mean, understanding Valdez as a Jesuit, but we're not seeing him as a religious figure that is one of the first Jesuits that arrived, San Mestizo. And one of the readings or understandings of the figure of Valdez being part of the Cusco church at the time is that he was a reconciling force. So kind of like evoking the Catholic religion as having the duty in these moments of rebellions to be sort of the solution of the reconciling force. However, I find it in particular in this drama hard to believe that this reconciling force or reconciliation objective is indeed religious, because there is no reference to religion in the drama, not even what we could call paganism. So there's in colonial times, of course, it wouldn't be referenced. If they're recreating this in pre-Hispanic times, they wouldn't be talking about Catholic Church or Christianity at all. But I found it hard to believe that in a way this sort of cannibalism, this sort of like recreation of a reconciliation moment needs to do anything with the church, because they didn't even mention pagan, paganas, pagan recreations of anything like that. I definitely, I mean, it's if anything, I think Valdez is probably the one that is considered to be the author, but I found it, one of the parts that I found a little bit hard to sort of like why he's not putting forward his religious agenda, knowing that the Catholic Church of Cusco at the time was supposed to kind of like reconcile this sort of factions of Cusco inhabitants who were against or in favor of Tupac Amaru or independence or against the Bourbon reforms. Yeah.
Thank you for your question. Primo Levi has helped me to shape my understanding of how the Jewish community in Argentina has dealt with their memories following the Dirty War, and some of his theories on remembering, but also over-remembering, are different ways that I'm able to see how they're dealing with rebuilding solidarity, Jewish solidarity, after these continued attacks on the community, specifically the more recent ones. And then with the arms trade with Israel, Israel was supplying weapons to Argentina during the war, and I guess my thought here is that there's a lot of criticism, there was a lot of criticism to Israel as their role in this, because it was known that Jews were being targeted, although they continued to supply the weapons and the arms to the military. But this is a big question that has not been investigated, and what I found as to why they did not come up until later in the Concept Nunca Más, when that became public in the human rights trials, then Israel sort of made a statement on this. Thank you.
Thank you.
So thank you all for your presentations. I have a particular question for Gina. You ended your presentation by saying, or by asking kind of rhetorically, why didn't the Jewish community come together? And I was thinking that maybe one of the places you could look for an answer, I'd like to hear your thoughts about this, is the huge kind of religious secular divide within the Jewish community. Right, I wanted you to talk, if you could, a little bit more about the role of rabbis, for example, in Argentina, and their role during the Dirty War, and then of course after the Dirty War, right? Recently, all across Latin America, rabbis are kind of epicenter of power, especially with respect to Israel, right? For even calling someone Jewish, right? And so I was wondering if there were, if there were, I mean, you talked about Rosenthal, right? But I'm imagining that there were far more rabbis on the other side of things. And yeah, just talking.
Yes, and well, the rabbi has taken a great role in Jewish leadership, of course, in Argentina specifically, as you say. I think that Marshall Mayer and Rosenthal, what they were able to do is they were able to show that we will speak out regardless of the danger we're in, where this did not happen by other community leaders. And I don't know if their role as rabbi allowed them this strength or this power in a way to be able to do that. But I think that's a really interesting way to look at maybe a turn to that question, an answer. I'm now thinking of this attack in the community, what took place in the Dirty War, and again in the attacks in the 90s, as like attacks on the community in a long thread of Jewish targeting throughout history. And these are just moments where we can study them and learn from them, and how different leaders stepped up in those specific moments.
I'd say a follow-up could be, I mean, first of all, that was a secular organization, correct?
Yes, secular, but it was supposed to be like representative as a whole.
Right, so maybe thinking about the role of rabbis within Gaia itself, right, and how these quote-unquote secular organizations are really much more complicated.
Yes, thank
Thank
you.
you.
Yes, please.
Trying to process this really wonderful set of papers and thinking about what brings them together. And to me, something that does bring them together is the ruse of sovereignty. So the way in which, for example, in your paper, the sovereignty of the nation, which is so important in leftist, historiography of the 20th century in Latin America, is undone or undoes indigenous sovereignty, or can't even contemplate these extra forms of territoriality that the indigenous might have, heterogeneously, right? I mean, they're not going to be the same forms of territoriality across the Americas, but I think of Victoria and his argument that it's precisely what makes the indigenous their indigenous universal reason is precisely what requires them to allow the Spaniards to come among them and trade and proselytize, And so I think that kind of colonial origin is still present in that, it's how can the indigenous not allow, us to come and use, even if it is on their territory, the subsoil is not. And the kind of like fear of the converso in the Americas, like the idea that to me it's utterly not surprising, that there would be a specific focus on Jews in Argentina, right? Because there's again that holdover of the dangerous converso challenging the sovereignty of the Catholic Church. And I just love what you do with the cannibal man. That's just that rock. I love the way you take and you're like, yeah, and I'm gonna, I really like that. And I mean, obviously there are competing sovereignties happening in New Mexico as well.
Would anybody comments or thoughts, responses?
Well, yeah, it is in Venezuela. It is very clear how the discourses of the state have taken the idea of indigenous peoples, even though in Venezuela, indigenous peoples are only 2% of the population, unlike Bolivia, for example, is more than 60%. But even so, the indigenous subject has been constructed as a sovereign, as a symbol of sovereignty. In fact, October 12th, the day of Columbus Day, it used to be called in Venezuela the Day of the Race. And Chavez changed it to the Day of Indigenous Resistance as a whole. And you could ask what resistance. But yeah, and even in objects in material civilizations that represent the state, like stamps, or or what we were taught what we were taught in school, like you were saying, how the indigenous are this warrior-like figure and was there representing kind of sovereign subject that represents Venezuela at the same time. So having this movement practically like contesting sovereignty from within Chavismo, it's not an anti-Chavista movement at all. It's a movement for good government. Reminds us of these other uprisings carried out in defense of the king, for example, indigenous uprisings in the colonial period. It's kind of the same strategy.
Are there different signifiers for subsoil? Are there a variety of terms for subsoil? What are the words?
In Venezuela?
Yeah.
Oil.
Yeah, but no, I mean in the language. What is the...
Oh, in the indigenous
Yes,
language.
yeah.
I'm not sure, but there's a term called oweja that represents, it's kind of a blend of space and time. It means world, it means day, and it includes territory. So there's not a very clear separation between, how do you say, the time, right? The movement of the sun and the space that we have, and it changes. It's not even the European notion of territory is not continuous. Right? It's not one solid territory. It has spaces between that don't belong to any community.
Kind of like mirroring what you were saying about kind of like how these themes come back. I think it's, if we kind of zoom in within 2 or 3 decades of colonial Peru, and we're talking about kind of like a Neo-Incan period, late 18th century, we kind of like want to revive and put forward Quechua literature. And as soon as, that whole show goes down in terms of like there's execution of Tupac Amaru and his cousin, and then kind of like that thing didn't kind of work, you see that the societal distribution of the city of Cusco, like the number of people that call themselves indigenous in the beginning of the 19th century, after all this Tupac Amaru ended, they kind of like tried to merge into, maybe we are kind of more criollos, and like maybe we shouldn't probably revive the Quechua literature, maybe we need to find another way out. And then when the wave of, talking about Bolívar, San Martin, the whole wave of like, oh, maybe we need actually a white figure in colonial times to kind of find a solution. So it's like, it's interesting how this is kind of like a cyclical, and kind of we kind of read modernist, like the pink tide, and now the going down of the pink tide, and all those things in kind of this sort of changes, but within colonial times and within how rapidly within 20 years, also those sort of tensions and changes of discourse change so quickly. I mean, when we look at it like in a bigger picture, it doesn't seem like it. It seems like it was, over decades. But when we put it in perspective, I'm talking about the case in Peru. I know very little about the Mexican case, but I think in Peru it's very, very interesting to see how failure activates another discourse, and when that happens, then another one comes in, and it's a funny fact. And I think that that's sort of like entropy that I'm calling is what I see in Oriental and I see in a lot of drama, because in a way I see that performance in a sort of way is a personal process, and I think a lot of things that probably is not captured too much through historical accounts is what these sort of performances put forward. And thinking all the way back on the conquest of Jerusalem in Mexico, where indigenous figures perform as Hernán Cortés, and they perform as Los Moros and the Jews, and it's sort of like the double layer of performance. Sort of like, what's going on? What happened in those Mayas and indigenous performing in our contest that was also dressed as a sultan on top of it? So it's just like, I don't know. It's just like there's a lot of bodily understanding of these identities and changes that I'm going on with this, that I find it particularly interesting.
Other questions? Just going off of this, because I work in theater too, so sorry, this is kind of raw. So
And Jeff's question about the Eucharist also, so you say it's a personal process, but there's also the theater is sort of a ritual space. I was wondering what the history of the who are the audience? That's one question. Also, it just reminds me of theater. It's in Europe, the European context. There's this book, Colonized on French theater, talking about how in the Baroque and Renaissance there was this going back, and throughout Europe going back to Roman theater, and the possibility that although they were putting on these kind of stately themes, there was also the position of possibly of colonized at the same time that the European nations were colonizing. It's complex, and I'm not completely convinced by that argument, but it's rich because there might be some kind of historical, theatrical, mestizo element that I think you're onto something with, whether it's anatomical or who knows, And then for Nick, the way that you describe the two, your conclusion is so beautiful, I think, and to me it almost seemed theatrical in a way, that are like a film, like a Tarantino film in a way. I want to see this drama, this kind of moment of this very philosophical question of whether it was an oppression or a liberatory act at the same time, and there are all of these forces at play when you see a film or a play, and it's so visual too, just all these characters, and I was wondering, just your methodology there too, kind of how you come to this moment where why is that question so important?
We're running, I was wondering if we wanted to put I saw two other questions, and maybe we could put those out too, and actually, so maybe the two other hands I saw, we could have those questions go out.
Yeah, I actually wanted to, it might pick up on Nick's question a little bit for Nick and Santiago. I saw a relationship between your papers insofar as you problematize the kind of the kind of categories of autonomy with relationship to the economic, with relationship to capital. And so for Nick, what's interesting is that what looks to us like this kind of potentially anti-capitalist resistance is actually pro-capitalist resistance, and then what looks for you like anti-capitalist or indigenous, pro-indigenous is not affirming those principles at all, but rather is producing very similar conditions economically. So I was interested in Santiago in terms of this formulation you had about Venezuela's entrance, or I forget exactly what wording was, into the capitalist mode of production. I was curious what precisely that meant. But I was wondering if you guys could just talk a little bit about what seems to be this really interesting story, which presupposes that there is something very simplistic about thinking resistance, especially violent resistance, or state building, shifting toward indigenous values, these things as essentially anti-capitalist, and the way in which that's not the whole story,
I thought there was another question over here. Correct.
I can save my comments for individually afterwards.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. So we'll open it up then.
I think mine is not related to the other two, so probably can. So a couple of things in terms of audiences, and one of the questions was in terms of the audience, and the other kind of like sort of references to the past. And I think one of the examples, and these are opposed in terms of like timeline wise, is probably the case of Motolinia in Mexico, and how he created, in a way, he needed to create a history for the Indians. He needed to, like, as a way of he needed to historicize a past that was not his. So in a way, he kind of needed his only reference at that time was the ancient world, and kind of like imagining sort of like mythologically or ancient Roman, history, kind of relate that. And he, of course, interviewed the oldest and the most, the elderly Indians in the España. But in a way, those Indians put forward a central filter of what they would tell them and what but they will just withhold. And one of the things that he did was this play, this massive play called The Conquest of Jerusalem. And that Conquest of Jerusalem was performed by over, like, I think 2,000 Indians in like a huge space. It's like 4 times like a football field. So imagine a bunch of Indios doing that, and the audiences were themselves and were other Indios. And the Conquest of Jerusalem kind of is, I feel, is a metonymic relation to the battles of the Moros versus the Judíos, and kind of like and the taking of Jerusalem, and kind of evoking Motolinia as a priest, kind of putting forward or justifying evangelization, and kind of like saying, okay, all these Judíos, above all, religion and Catholicism wins over. On the other side, so we have this type of audience and kind of like, reference to the ancient world and reference to this sort of quest, like cruzadas and defeating and all of that was kind of utilized to create a certain discourse in theater. We have the religious theater, we have Eucharist theater, we have Criollo theater, and we can go off. But like kind of like going back to Ollantay, there are historical accounts that even say that Diego Cristobal Tupac Amaru was one of the audience members of Ollantay. Because what happens is that Diego Cristobal Tupac Amaru, the cousin of Tupac Amaru II, was forgiven by the king and was actually, they signed a peace treaty. So some said that Valdez, or whoever wrote this Ollantay, kind of wanted to put forward Tupac Yupanqui and this was called reconciling, forgiving force. And sort of like, I believe that plays that were more later into the colonial period had more of like a selective type of audience. It wasn't, I believe didn't have like a particularly religious agenda to put forward that could massively affect people, but it was more of like who were the political protagonists at this time of rebellions in the late 18th century. I think it was, to me, it kind of like the audiences were kind of like narrowing the specificity, and that's why I think there's a lot of ideological force in this particular performance that would actually tap on the specific people that were involved in this political mess. That is my take, and that's what I feel. I mean, going from Montolinia and goes to Jerusalem 300 years after, I think there's been like some sort of filtering of who was seeing this and who were the audiences of what was the mindset of these mestizos when they were writing this. It wasn't, a play of like 2,000 Indios, playing the word sultanes and all of this. It was now a political, there is a characterization, there's a creation of a personaje, I think that is definitely more, I find it intricate and enriching later in colonial times.
Santiago?
Yeah, if I may. So to try to address these questions together, I pulled a lot out of this paper, obviously to shorten it for this. But it's very interesting in terms of this question of indigeneity and the way indigeneity functions, particularly because this drama, if you will, doesn't take place, like there aren't indigenous people involved in it. But at the same time, like a sort of, in a lot of the primary source material that I'm working with, this sort of discourse of indigeneity, this sort of like paternalistic discourse, also this notion that the Hispanos are sort of like anti-progress, that they're sort of wedded to a subsistence way of life that sort of predates the sort of American takeover of the territory, is like, I think really key in sort of negotiating this colonial relationship, right? So it's a very interesting way that like indigenous identity can function as this like means of sort of justification for colonial domination. And I think you see that very clearly in this case being sort of deployed, right? And it's so stark because these aren't indigenous people, So it's interesting in that respect. And then I think, so like the question of why this drama, right, is I think in keeping with this this question of what motivated them, right, is this notion of, or this question rather of whether it was sort of an active move or whether it was sort of reactive, right? Whether they were reacting to change or like reacting to change broadly, and then they just wanted things to stay the same, or whether they were reacting to their exclusion from what was happening in the area, right? And this is what I think we have to see this as, well, I think in this case too, it's particularly clear that they weren't anti-capitalist, right? In many ways, they were sort of embracing this sort of new order that was coming in all around them, and this rebellion, rather than being sort of naturalistic reaction to change, was instead like a very clear identification of their systematic exclusion from the system, right? They're trying to participate in it in a number of different ways, and they get shut down, right? So when the violence finally does emerge, it's not this kind of natural phenomenon. It's not a thunderstorm, right? It's not a swarm of insects. It's not a plague. It is a choice, right? And so I think that question of the drama, right, is it is somewhat speculative, but I think I want to explore what that choice is, right, and how they're making it.
Also like what you said about the contradictory visions of the future that come into play in this sort of clashes. I think that's something similar might be happening in Venezuela, so has happened always. And I think it's a question related to the idea of nation and the discourses of the nation that are legitimated at one moment. Right? And I see the nation as this kind of mediation between state and capital. Right? Nation always, to me, corresponds to a project of development. So the way I think that this case is so interesting because it points out to a kind of a breakdown in this discourse of the nation. Right? When you have indigenous peoples, rising or speaking against Maduro, for example, against the state, against the way the state has handled its own sovereignty, then you start seeing changes in this mode of production, and you probably begin to see that in Venezuela in the following months. There's problems going on right now with mining concessions and mining areas. We saw something about 20 miners being killed, and so the discourse is about development is going to probably start to change and start to adapt and use this medium of the nation that's going to have to be revamped in a way. And there was another part to your question about resistance, right? And you said something about resistance. How is it possible to resist?
Well, I guess what I was interested in is the idea that if you have a leftist government, that is trying to accommodate this other sovereignty, what is or parallel sovereignty, however you want to think about it, what is the relationship to capital, insofar as capital is a force that violently polices labor power. So it's like if the miners don't go to work, what happens? If the state is leftist, how does it negotiate the fact that it has to police labor? How does that happen?
Yeah, I can understand.
I think in South Africa there's very similar problems, right? Where you have this kind of this history of Marxism. However, miners are continually assassinated, and so to me it's this interesting paradox where it's precisely not problematic for them to do whatever, to do whatever they need to police the labor power. But the question is, how does the discourse shift, right? And so what you're talking about is this question of nation, and I think you're right that nation becomes a certain index for this problematic, But I just wonder in this case, how do you feel this plays out?
What I see is, what's so radical and dangerous is not that you put forward the government, is that it takes its ideology literally, and it wants it to really work. Right? So I don't know. It's probably too complicated. I can't answer all of that right now, but I think it doesn't stay so much in resistance as just blocking the entrance of capital to the state.
I see.
But it tries to go beyond that and imagine different ways of being in common. So kind of seeing beyond resistance.
Okay.
I was thinking, Jack, that South Africa, right, in the sense that this is the history of mining for
Right,
a long time,
yeah,
millennia.
yeah, yeah.
I mean, we are in the second biggest land grab since I think the conquest in Latin America. I mean, and in other parts of the world, but we are in the second biggest land grab precisely because of the way in which particular resources, biodiversity, is mapped directly onto indigenous territories.
Yeah.
So there is, and then I mean, I think actually the dirty wars have made leftist governments in Latin America like neoliberal. Like there isn't a leftist
Yeah,
government
exactly.
in the world, in Latin America, that can object to extractivism, that can object to free trade, that isn't begging for maquiladoras to come to their, you know what I mean? And that's the success of the dirty wars, right? Because, well, what the dirty wars and all the way into the, counter-revolutionary wars in Central America, what became really evident was the cost of saying no, to this, this kind of capitalist hegemony. And I remember like when, 2010 comes and all of Mexico is having this millennial, oh, there's gonna be the next revolution. And, I was in Mexico and all the Mexicans said, oh, hell no, we don't want what happened to Central America to happen to us, right? So there's a real continuing, in the imaginary of the dirty wars.
That's a great note to close on, perhaps. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.